Awesome. There we go. I'm going to turn on auto transcription, but you are welcome to turn it off on your own. If it's distracting to you, you can turn it off below, just so that you know. I'm Dr. Alicia Shadaman. For those who have not been to a previous presentation, I'm the director of our Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at Northern Illinois University. We have an undergraduate program in nonprofit and NGO studies, and we support capacity building for nonprofits, as well as trying to share the latest academic research. So that's why I asked Jason to join me this afternoon. We are recording, and this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel later this afternoon, kind of as soon as it processes. So I'll pop that into the chat once we get started. So I want to welcome you for joining us from near and far. Today's presentation is called Donors, Government Grants, and Nonprofit Performance. And back when we could go to conferences, Jason and I would run into each other at different academic conferences. He's an associate professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State, but he's got Midwest connections. So he's got a PhD in strategic management from the University of Illinois at Chicago and a BA in economics from the University of Michigan. So he's an accomplished scholar, publishing in many top journals, and does a great deal of applied research and engagement in North Carolina. And you can check out his work on his public performance lab, which I didn't know about. So now I've got to go check that out too. Your mics are muted right now, but please put your questions and comments into the chat and we'll monitor those. Jason will give his presentation, then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A section at the end. So Jason, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. And nice to see a few familiar faces and meet new ones. So give me a second to share my screen. I was telling my students somehow, despite having had to do this for a year, I'm somehow worse at Zoom than I was 12 months ago. So apologies. All right. Can everybody see that? I think we're good. Okay. So I need to ask a sort of quick couple of conditions for forgiveness. So the first one is, despite me actually succeeding in getting rid of my kids for a couple of hours, my neighbors decided to get their tree removed. So if there are extraneous noises, please forgive them for picking this time to do that. Okay, cool. So happy to talk today about government grants, donors, and nonprofit performance. So this is an extension of some work in nonprofit performance theory and measurement that I've been engaged in the past couple of years. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about me very briefly and then introduce the topic in terms of how we framed it. And then I'll be brief with regard to what exactly we did to explore the relationships that we posit. And I'll conclude with some implications and thoughts for what comes next. All right, cool. So thank you, Alicia, for the introduction. As Alicia mentioned, I'm an associate professor of public administration at the NC State SPIA, but I am a native of Chicago, right? So I grew up on the far south side, on the border of, for those of you in the area, like 138th Street, on the border of the city in Riverdale. So my roots are definitely as a South Sider. Go Sox. My undergraduate training is at the University of Michigan in economics, for a master's degree in teaching from Dominican University in River Forest, so somewhat close to where you guys are. And my PhD is in strategic management from UIC. So my main research interest has really always been the efficiency of and performance of public service delivery. And as you all know, nonprofits take on a pretty substantial load in our society of delivery of public services. And so my work in nonprofits sort of come in that, with nonprofits come in that dimension. My scholarship, though, typically pulls pretty heavily from institutional economics and management science. So a lot of applied econometrics, operations management, and sort of theory from that domain, which I'm happy to talk more about later on. So my direct work with nonprofits, which I've done quite a bit of, and public agencies as well, has usually been with regard to using management science and sort of lessons from the way economists think about nonprofits and public agencies to sort of help guide decision-making and improve performance. I know the sort of standard logic for that is sort of cost cutting, and like that's sort of totally not my perspective, it's more about strategic decision making, and the ways to sort of leverage what we know about what's working and what isn't, to help make that next decision, including how to expand public services as well. So definitely, I think about performance broadly, right? Okay, so this particular paper, so I attended, as Lisa mentioned, I'm a regular in our NOVA, the annual nonprofit sort of academic conference. Although there's healthy representation from practitioners as well. And I sat through a paper. I say sat through it. Actually, it was a really good paper that tried to pull some lessons for public service delivery from institutional economics. And one of the interesting topics was regarding the notion that economists that study nonprofits and philanthropy at large, there's a pretty much a consensus that philanthropists are not really rewarding nonprofits for performing well when they donate, right? That there are a host of other reasons that people give. I'm sure many of you know them much better than me, but it's not necessarily performance. And when it comes to public service delivery, that creates a little bit of a tension in the economics literature, mostly because to be considered sort of efficient or a well-designed sort of institutional apparatus for delivering public services, right? The nonprofits or the entities or sort of sectors of society that provide the most effective and most robust public services should be the ones that attract the most funding. But because we know that isn't the case, we think that isn't the case, this creates an interesting tension, right, around our nonprofits. What does it say about nonprofits as an instrument of public service delivery? And so if you walk back to the way that economists typically think about nonprofits, in part, nonprofits are often defined in this literature by the difficulty of measuring what they do, right? And this won't be news to many of you who work in this domain, but nonprofits often provide services that are very difficult to measure inherently. In fact, that's often why we ask nonprofits to do them, right? Public agencies often can't. There can be disagreement about how much and to whom we should produce, on whose behalf we should produce. And if it can't be measured, and if there are sort of clear profit outcomes, sort of profit-oriented institutional designs are inappropriate as well. And so we as a society ask nonprofits to do things that are inherently sort of difficult to measure. And because it's difficult or sort of nearly impossible to construct these measurements of performance, and sometimes about what's working and what isn't, in a way that people can see and easily understand and interpret, we suspect that donors instead look for warm glow, right? So we can trust nonprofits to deliver services, and that's why we do. And so the things that nonprofits do that facilitate trust, or these sort of warm fuzzies, right, that we get about what we're contributing to, are sort of why people give, right? It's less about the sort of hard numbers about who's getting what, who's spending what, et cetera, et cetera. Although there are sort of convincing studies that donors do look at financial ratios. But it's largely sort of what makes donors feel good, right? And that's challenging, right? Because sort of even when potentially useful indicators of performance exist, like lots of nonprofits, for instance, we work with one in Raleigh that packaged meals for local families experiencing housing insecurity, and they have pretty reliable counts, right, of what they package. We still find that it can be really difficult to use that information to help guide decisions, right? And so Mitchell and Calabrese in a paper in Nonprofit Policy Forum, which is open access for those who may want to read it. It's a really good paper in my estimation. And it's the paper I sat through in Arnova a couple of years ago that piqued my interest. So outline the cost of doing so really well, right? It's hard to use performance to make decisions, both for donors and for nonprofits, right? So for donors, they're what are called search and discovery costs, right? It's really difficult to find the nonprofits that provide the services you're interested in. And then if they do, it's sort of difficult to find measures of that performance, right? And that can be costly. There are also decision-making costs, right? And with regard to, even if I could find that data or find some sort of useful information about, who's providing what and how much, it can be really difficult to use that information to make decisions, right? That's not always straightforward. How much is enough? What's a lot? What's efficient, right? These are difficult questions for human beings to answer. And then there are monitoring costs, right? So even if I can I find a measure, how do I know that that measure is accurate, is sort of mapped onto what I think it is? And so it can be difficult for donors. It also can be difficult for nonprofits. And again, so folks who work their day-to-day is with philanthropic, with nonprofit and charitable organizations. This won't be a surprise, right? That it's hard for nonprofits to think about their performance too. There can be distortion costs, right? In the sense that if you try to measure performance and do so in a way that's inaccurate, where you're not capturing well what your mission is, it can distort what you do, right? And so, mapping your organization or your public service provision in a way that's inconsistent with your mission is not good, right? And there's always the risk of doing that. There can be evaluation costs. This won't be a surprise either, right? Measuring your performance is expensive, and nonprofits that are already strapped or trying to use every resource they have to actually provide the public services consistent with their mission, the cost to setting aside resources to evaluate and collect data on performance and how well things are working, that can be tricky, right? And those costs can be high. There are also auditing costs, right? How do I measure what I measure well, right? How do I know that the individuals within the nonprofit that I task with measuring performance are doing so in a way consistent with what I expect? These are all very costly, right? And so this link between how nonprofits perform public service delivery and the ways that which we can use that to make resource decisions and decisions about contribution can be tricky. So instead, and this is I should have cited this. I disappeared on the thing. So sorry. This is also from the Mitchell, adapted from the Mitchell and Calabrese piece. So we end up in this loop, right, where donors give in a way that donors contribute resources, the nonprofit receives those resources, and they exhibit trustworthiness somehow, right, in a way where I'm communicating with donors. This could be everything from a brochure to an overhead ratio that makes it look like I'm, sort of conveying some feel good, right? And so then the donor receives this sort of license to feel good and contributes more resources. The problem for Mitchell and Calabrese, though, if you look at this, sort of more carefully on the right-hand side there, I'm gonna show my bad drawings. Sorry if I look like a kindergartner here. Right, public benefit is all the way over here on the right. Notice this is not in this loop, right? And so for Mitchell and Calabrese, this can be an issue because how do we know if what I'm doing, the degree to which what I'm doing contributes in the way that I'm hoping it does, particularly when it comes to public service delivery, right? And so this can be tricky, right? A tricky problem. The challenge, though, is that theory focuses heavily on donors, right? And as we know, that's a really limited way to think about where nonprofits get resources. Among other sources as well, nonprofits, particularly those that are engaged in public service delivery, are often supported and sometimes supported heavily by government grants, right? And this is tricky because if we're going to question the entire nonprofit institutional design, we need to think carefully about all the resources, right? And so governments, grant nonprofits funding, and there's reason to think, at least in my estimation, that government entities might be a lot better at sort of observing and rewarding public performance. This is for a couple of reasons I posit, right? The first one is that, and I've worked with nonprofits that work a lot with government. Often, as a condition of receiving the grants, you have to report performance or have a system for doing so, right? where did the money go? How much did you spend? You need to communicate, right? Like, what you did and what you intend to do with it. And so the implementation of that performance system sort of can create and facilitate exchange where the government entities granting nonprofits the resources can better observe the degree to which public services are being delivered. The second reason is on the nonprofit side itself, right? So sometimes the capacity for measuring performance, because it's a requirement so often for government grants, not always, but can come from the grant itself, right? And so the grant can provide the capacity to collect data on performance, or capacity and or the impetus to collect data for performance, and to remit that performance data to nonprofit, to the government entities. And so we think that, at least I posit, there may be a better, in the way economists think about it, exchange between performance and resources between governments and nonprofits than between donors and nonprofits. So the big takeaway here from how we think about this is it's difficult for donors to observe and reward nonprofits for performance. I've got a paper published earlier this year that sort of reifies that. But we think that government entities, sort of regardless of level, maybe better at it. Okay, so how do we measure this empirically, right? There's very little. We have lots in the way of theory about this, but it's difficult to measure empirically because sort of a valid construction of what a measurement of like what nonprofits do, a measurement of performance delivery public service delivery can be so hard to catch. And so in this paper with Madeline Lachelle, who is one of the most talented MPA students I think I've ever worked with, we combined an internal production report, which got from Habitat for Humanity, with financial and organization data from the IRS Form 990. And the idea behind it is we really want to see if improving performance leads to more donations. And then we do the same thing with government grants. So does improving performance lead to more donations, and does it lead to more government grants, right? All right, so we ended up examining about 500 Habitat for Humanity affiliates. We had a total of about 1,500 that we had performance data for. Most of those are small affiliates, though, that don't regularly report. They use the easy form of the IRS 990. And so when we combine them, combine the affiliates that which we had both 990 data for and the production reports, we ended up with a sample of about 500, right? So about a third of the total number of affiliates for which we received a production report for. And that's because most affiliates, again, are either smaller or don't receive government grants, right? So we're really looking at the sample that receives government grants, which makes this a lot different than saying this overall about Habitat affiliates. So we need to be very careful about that. So we built an 8-year panel, right, combining these two things. And the thing that panel allowed us to do is to better approximate cause and effect, right? And so we can use what happens over time to form a better approximation of what the cause and effect relationship is of performance and increases in resources. And so just for a little context, Habitat for Humanity didn't accept government funding for a while, right? And sort of and it's Habitat's a pretty decentralized organizations, really more of a loosely affiliated set of organizations than it is sort of one sort of highly organized hierarchy. But as an entity, right, the Habitat only formally started accepting really limited amounts of government funds in 1996. But in 2001, it substantially deepened the revenue streams from government. We see sources primarily both from federal and local government. So HUD provides lots of grants to local habitats, and then local governments pretty substantially fund habitat operations as well. And so what's important to know from this, I think, is that Habitat, from my readings and discussions with folks in the offices, they work really hard to establish independence, right? And they don't, it's, you have a hard time finding a Habitat affiliate that takes on any fund, any resources from government that are not geared towards something the affiliate was going to do anyway, right? So it's less of a contract relationship on average, and much more of a grants relationship, a grant making relationship. Most of the resources are to offset the cost of property acquisition, the related costs of home building, which is the primary mission of Habitat for Humanity, right? Habitat does other work regarding advocacy for housing insecurity and some international work that is primarily funded through its central office. But the main job of the affiliate, the Habitat for Humanity local affiliates, which is the unit of analysis we use here, are sort of building, repairing, and rehabilitating houses for use by families who would otherwise be housing insecure. This is a snapshot of the affiliates that we look at. So again, they're a little bit on the larger side, right? So the average amount of donations is about 650,000, and then average amount of government grants is about 110,000. Again, we're sort of looking at the larger Habitat affiliates, and so what we glean from this sort of less useful for smaller habitats, and obviously less useful for smaller nonprofits overall, right? So this is, on average, these are our larger nonprofits and larger affiliates in larger cities. Okay, so we estimate this relationship, right? We take a look at it with what's known as a dynamic panel estimator. And I've got, I'm happy to talk in more detail for those interested, but essentially it's a statistical technique that accounts for the ways that organizations change over time. And in doing so, the way that it does it is designed to sort of better approximate cause and effect, right? And so we can, in a sense, control for all of the things unique, or many of the things unique about organizations in a way that sort of isolates the effect, in this case, of performance on both donations, right? And I'm a kindergartner, sorry. My university would not spring for the touch laptop, unfortunately, so I'm clicking and dragging here. And then the same thing with government grants, right? And so we're interested in the relationship. Does this cause this? And then does this cause that, right? So two things here. My apologies for the script. Okay, so we ran our dynamic panel estimator, and here's what we mostly found, right? That sort of as expected, building more houses, so our key performance measure, and I'm happy to talk more about how we compose that, it didn't meaningfully increase donations, right? So the effect was really small and indistinguishable from zero, right? So on average, building more homes didn't increase donations. Now, we wouldn't, again, for the reasons we talked about earlier, we wouldn't expect it to. And also, like, Habitat affiliates are not building houses to get more donations. They're building houses so that people can use them. So this isn't necessarily a knock. It's just a feature of it seems to be a feature of the institutional design, at least as we found it empirically, in the way that Mitchell and Calabrese constructed itself. But we did find that building more homes, rehabbing more homes, did increase government grants. So ceteris paribus, the effect that we found was relatively small, but much bigger than the sort of zero that we found on the donor side, right? So on average, sort of increasing an increase, like a 10% increase in performance, right? And sort of, in homes built or rehabbed, did increase grant funding by nearly 3%, which is sort of an interesting externality, positive externality, right? In addition to the homes, it does look a little bit like there is a sort of small amount of grant revenue that comes, increased grant revenue that comes with sort of delivering more public services, which is our sort of the way we account for we account for performance. But this is a sort of a visual account of what we found. If this top line here, sorry, some more scribble, maybe we should use a different color scribble. Maybe that'll make it less. Okay, so this top line here, right, is what we found with donations, right? So this side is donations, and down here is production. As you can see, as production goes up, right, we don't really see a huge increase in donations. This line is sort of more or less zero, right? As production increases, donations don't increase very much, right? Statistically, this is indistinguishable from zero. But if you look at this line down here, right? I'm gonna, that's baby P green. Let's try something different. Okay. If we look at this line down here, right? So same thing, production on this side, all right? And then grants on this side, you'll notice the lower amount, right? Their Habitat affiliates on average receive many more donations than the government grants. But look at this relationship, right? As performance goes up, as Habitat affiliates build more houses, and this is controlling for as much as we could, pretty much. And this is, we think, a causal effect here, or plausibly causal, that look at what we find. Building more houses seems to, the slope of this line is, again, it's about 0.3, right? It sort of meaningfully, at least in my estimation, you see a clear relationship between more grants and performance, which again is not why you build a house, but it does look like, that government seems to be at least more responsive on average than donors are. These are elasticities, right? So at the margin, and they can be, difficult to extract value judgments from them in a vacuum. So we compare them, and at least we're interested. We find this to be interesting. So two takeaways before I'll shut up. So nonprofits serve because of their mission, right? And the idea is not to serve, to attract donors. But our findings do add to the sort of growing body of evidence. We've got two manuscripts, one published, one hopefully soon to be published, that sort of give some credence to this, that donors give for reasons mostly other than performance, right? That's a huge body of literature that enumerates the reasons that people give to nonprofits. But we don't see evidence that, at least in this context, and it's certainly consistent with the way that most economists think about this, that performance is really, really why, right? It's hard to observe, right? But government grants seem to respond a little bit to performance. And, it could be, as we posited earlier, that, government, that the systems, the requirements that often come as a prerequisite to get into grants in the first place actually allow governments to respond, government entities to respond in a way that is useful. And so for those of you who work at or with nonprofit entities, I know all that paperwork can be hella annoying, right? When you're getting a grant and they want this form and that form and this follow-up and this check-in 6 months out. But it appears, at least in our case, there may be some evidence that they're using it, right? It's not just checking in for the sake of checking in. That the more you do, the more likely you are to be funded in the future. So sort of the two takeaways that we think are important. This, of course, comes with some caveats. Our finding, again, doesn't mean that donors don't care about performance. It just means that we think it's hard to observe, right? But I do think that there's some evidence that particularly recently, that people are trying, right? The initiatives like Impact Matters and Give Well, et cetera, with all of their imperfections, suggest that there are efforts by philanthropists to better link funding to performance. Another big blind spot, and we can't distinguish in our data foundation giving and individual donor giving. It all appears as one thing. And so the foundations, because they are often larger organized hierarchies and they give higher amounts, can do the same thing governments do, right? As a condition of the funding, sort of design performance systems in a way where you're remitting information about what you're doing. And then they sort of condition future funding upon it. There are caveats with that too, right? I mean, foundations are not perfectly rational. They often give in ways that, are sort of sometimes self-utility maximizing, right? It often, the sort of strategic philanthropy, right, is sort of less about performance and more about what's good for the foundation and what the foundation sees as in its own best interest. But I do think it's something worth considering that's probably different behavior between foundations and then individuals who really face high costs, observing where, what happens with their money in terms of their resources in terms of public service provision. The second one is that we're looking at one context within one sector. It's really even more limited than that. I mean, it's not just housing within nonprofit. We just have habitat data. We don't even have data for all of the housing nonprofits, right? And so we're not, results may vary. Sort of the thing that sort of comes with most of anything you buy, right? You should be cautious, right? We're not saying, eat this pill, lose 20 pounds, but we don't, right? It's only sort of what we find here in this limited context that we do think what we find here we're confident that what we found is consistent within our study, right? That what we found is meaningful within this context, but this context is pretty limited, right? It's hard to extrapolate. That we should do this a lot, right? To me, there's lots of incentive, in my estimation, for the nonprofit. Again, like nonprofits do lots of things, right? But for the ones that deliver quantifiable public service deliveries, there may be, we should be funding nonprofits to collect and use performance data, particularly with a sense to improve decision making. And if to the extent that which we can do that, we can begin to replicate these things to sort of build and improve the systems that we have to make sure that we're getting the most out of the resources that we have, right? The people that depend upon nonprofits for the services they consume get the most out of it. But again, that's a sort of limited group of nonprofits in general that we're even theorizing to. Like, performance is hard in the nonprofit context, right? Often what we're doing is just doesn't neatly fit into these constructs that we can use and draw sort of meaningful inference from. We don't think anyway that that's always the case, right? But the degree to which that's possible certainly guides what we say our findings suggest, right? That often this is just not possible, right? So we want to acknowledge that up front, and I think it poses a further question, like how do we think about performance management in these spaces where measurement is really difficult or impossible? And I wrote a blog post with some colleagues at USC about why performance is important anyway. I do think it matters. There's a lot of pressure on the nonprofit institutional design, particularly for those of us who are concerned about inequality and the reasons that people give, right? Do people give in a way that facilitates inequality and power imbalance? And so for me anyway, thinking carefully about, are the communities benefiting from this design in the way that we intend them to, is important to those questions of equity, of power, and the kind of society that we want to live in, right? Where we're not just philanthropy is not done in a context that facilitates power imbalance. And so good performance theory, at least in my estimation, sort of can help us, make sure that it's actually about the delivery of public services and not something more sinister. So in summary, right, it's sort of well known, that philanthropists have a hard time responding to nonprofit performance, but public agencies have better systems, and it looks like in this case, there's some empirical back into that. So, all right, so shout out to the Office of Research and Innovation here at NC State, which is critical to us getting the working with Habitat. My co-authors, Jessica Barrett and Madeline Shell, for some great data work. And then shout out to Habitat and GuideStar for facilitating us getting access to some data that we think is pretty cool, right? It's rare to get nonprofit performance data. And so it has allowed us to at least approximate some answers to some questions we think are interesting. Okay, that's it. Happy to take questions and discuss more.
Yeah. Do you want to put your email address into the chat,
Yeah.
Jason,
Oh,
and then people can grab it from there? And as you were chatting, I was putting in like links to the articles because
oh, cool.
the two that you mentioned are both open access, so folks can get that, and then they can read your blog post. I'm sure there are others, but I just grabbed that one
Oh, thank you.
and put that in there
Helpful.
for you. And I think when I first heard Jason give this talk at Arnova, I'm like, damn, why didn't I think of that? Because it is a quantifiable thing, like building something, renovating something versus like improving mental health. You're like, oh, it's a one of those things you're like, I didn't think of that. But I don't think I thought of it because I'm not an economist. And so sometimes that view and that lens is so useful because you are a little bit distant from it and you think of things in a different way. I think, sometimes my own background is more public administration. So yeah, I don't think there are that many economists that are doing this work. I mean, there's some at the University of Chicago looking at philanthropy and giving, but I don't think I don't know of any others, maybe you do, in this performance measurement space. So what kind of attracted you to this little niche area?
Thanks. So I should caution out. My PhD is not in economic. The economists would throw things at me for using that label. So I want to be. I did start out as a student in the econ PhD program, and moved to management when there was a big fight at UIC. And long story short, I went with actually the people who ended up causing the fight. So I don't know what that says about me. Anyway, I've always been interested in this. I worked in a public school system. In a past life, I was a fourth grade math teacher, and one of the fascinating things about working in Chicago, and I don't say this pejoratively, Chicago is home, but it is a very corrupt city, right? And so one of the things that was interesting to me was the degree to which the public agencies and nonprofits had to manage that the sort of institutional culture there and what it might mean for how they perform, right? And so often the things that, for instance, we were asked to do as teachers, or everything from like how we did reading tests to snow shoveling, right? You could argue that there was some other thing happening there that wasn't actually about whether or not the snow got shoveled. And so it got me thinking carefully about the ways that, outside managing sort of external power dynamics can affect the way that public agencies and nonprofits perform. Obviously, things like corruption are really hard to get your arms around and understand. So I ended up thinking a lot more about measuring and theorizing performance and efficiency in these spaces that are so critical, right? I mean, we've got lots of, we designed a society where there are lots of poor people. And as bad as that is, that seems to be the equilibrium in this country that we are at least okay with. And so we sort of mandate that people are, they depend on the public service provision that public agencies and nonprofits are tasked with doing. And it's critical for me that they actually get them, right? And and are able to use them and manage them well. So for me, efficiency and performance has always been about that. You're right that this has sometimes felt like a lonely space, but it's been one that has been a lot of fun.
I know one of the things when I first moved to Illinois, and maybe you have thoughts on if you could do this. So often, if you get a state grant from Department of Health and Human Services here in Illinois, what I want is their grant reports. Like, I want, what do they report? What do the organizations report? What did they say they were going to do at the beginning? What did they say they did at the end? And those get filed by, June 15th on the full moon, whatever. They get sent to Springfield or Chicago. They're not open access. Like I can't get them. I mean, I guess I could FOIA each one if I cared to, and figure that out, because I agree with you. When we say we're going to measure this, did we actually do that? And then did they get rewarded the next year? Either they met those goals and objectives, so you get rewarded with more money, or you didn't and you get rewarded with, you get less. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I really don't know from the government side. Is there that incentive to actually do better? Now, you have some results here that suggest governments actually do reward you if you perform better. But, especially on the health and human services, I'm like, do they? Do they? Because I don't know that.
No doubt. Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, government agencies can be, as you know, very political. That's definitely not an Illinois thing. I've had some experiences in North Carolina that have had my jaw on the floor with regard to the way that decisions are made and performance is accounted for. But no, definitely super interesting question.
Yeah.
I would love to get that data too, like actually look at the
Grant reports,
remittances.
right,
Yeah,
right, and the remittances back. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, no
So
doubt.
what are you working on in North Carolina? I mean, I know you did the Habitat project, but I know, and you have the Performance Lab. What are some questions that you guys are thinking about relative to what's going on in North Carolina?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I work some with nonprofits, but a lot with public agencies too. And so I'm at the start of, we were awarded a grant with the North Carolina Department of Transportation. I was actually on a similar project in Illinois where we're helping them reconstruct their performance measures to better capture human factors, right? Like the way that, so North Carolina actually has a very complicated, in part because of past issues with things like corruption, a very complex scoring system for instance, where a bus stop goes, right? But it's designed by like a bunch of engineers, right, who think about engineer things, which is good, right? But they don't often,
Not people.
yeah, not people, right? And so they have a hard time scoring like, does this bus stop connect this food desert to a grocery store? So it's a big team of us, and we're going to use some geospatial econometrics and some GIS stuff, and we're going to help them expand their scoring system, or at least propose an expansion. Whether or not they use it is a political question, right? But we're going to help them expand their scoring system to better include questions like that, particularly related to public health, right? And ways to use transportation and transit projects to help communities get better access to things they need, like healthy food and et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully that gets taken as a formal project. I'm actually at the beginning stages of a book about street gangs. This sounds sort of unrelated to performance, and I guess to some degree it is, but why they get so big, right? And what role that serves. So this came out of growing up in Chicago. Like, we have historically very, very large, it's not like that anymore, but as a kid, they were very large, well-organized gangs.
Bureaucracies, right?
Yeah.
You're still studying bureaucracy.
Right. No, it is.
Yeah,
There's really similar things. I guess I'm talking to a colleague here, because that's really hard to explain to people. Like, but I often wonder, in undergrad, I had lots of friends from Brooklyn, and their experience was very different. It was like these sort of street to street, crew to crew, my block versus, and I thought, why in Chicago in some cases they're so big, they've controlled traffic in Memphis and in Indianapolis. There is Chicago gang culture here in Raleigh. It's sort of how big these hierarchies got. And I wonder why, like, what purpose does the size serve? Why really big here and so small in other places? And so I think that's going to be a lot of fun. Those are the two major, and then some other work on straddling costs with nonprofits, like, if the degree to which I do, if I'm doing A and I decide I want to take on another mission, how does B compromise mission A? Less mission drift, right, where I'm taking resources from A and putting it to B, but more, even if they're totally resource independent, what does taking on B mean for mission A? Can I sort of impede myself in that regard? So those three things I think are what I'll be digging into over the next couple of years.
So you probably get asked this a lot, because I get asked this. I'm new. Our organization is small. Where do you start, or what do you recommend to do really good performance measurement, at least at the beginning, as a small nonprofit? So, and maybe Crystal, I tweaked your question a little bit, because I could anticipate maybe a little bit of that is, how do you start to be able to demonstrate impact? Maybe not as much as you say potentially on the donor side. That tends to be more testimonials, stories kind of stuff, but maybe on the foundation side and larger donors and government, things like that. What is some advice that you might offer? And if I have anything to add, I'll add it in. But
yeah, please do.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult, right? The biggest thing that I tell my students is the critical nature of strategic planning and strategic management, right? And so I think for me, what I would advise is to carefully develop a strategic plan that has outcomes and goals, and to really use that to help guide all of the organization's sort of decision making at the margin. And if I can't justify, if there's a proposal to do something and it is not directly related to the pursuit of the goals, the outcomes, and outputs, if they have them listed that I have, then that should guide my decision. And so when you're small and you don't have the capacity to do rigorous constructions of how much of this and auditing it and all of that, to me that's a nice way to get started and to keep yourself on track, is to really be religious, almost to have that strategic plan be like almost like a constitution, right? That you sort of follow rigorously, that you take serious and really help guide the nonprofit's decision making. And that should more or less keep you, if not quantifiably, so in a sense of verifying it, in line with how you would define how you want to perform.
And Jason and I didn't talk before this, but I just finished my book manuscript on strategic planning, which is very strange that you mentioned it. But I agree. I mean, unless you have very clear goals, it's going to be hard to figure out what should we be measuring. So I did dedicate a chapter to performance measurement. And I think especially if you're small, is what do you want to be able to say at the end? Do you want to be able to say that this percentage of individuals achieved X? Then measure that, like figure out kind of what you want to say, what's the impact that you want to have, what's going to resonate most in your organization. Because if staff are on board with the things that you measure, then you're halfway there. If you decide to measure something that staff don't care about, the data is going to be crap. The outcomes are going to be awful. Like there's just no way to do it unless there's really strong dedication to that internal commitment. So yeah, Kate, talking about a theory of change, thinking about what's the impact you want to have, and then kind of work backwards from that. And one of the things I stress when I chat about this is be humble in your expectations when you talk about change. And with my students, I'll often use the thing of like, if you're a dedicated Dunkin' Donuts person or a dedicated Starbucks, let me try to convince you to go to the other place. It's really hard, and that's a small thing, right? It's really hard if you're a dedicated coffee drinker, one or the other. So you can imagine if people have addiction or mental health or whatever, you're going to try and make substantial changes in 1 year. Unlikely, right? So be really humble and realistic in your expectations, then communicate, kind of why that's definitely challenging, because that's the space you're in. In a lot of cases, maybe other than an example that you use, which is Habitat, you're really trying to change lives, behaviors, knowledge. Those are really tough things to do, especially over time conditions. So I think that's some of the advice when I think about it. And like I said, we didn't talk about strategic planning before this conversation. Tracy, you had a great question. If I unmute you, you want to just ask it directly?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So I'm someone who is mostly focused on sort of the individual level, and that barrier is definitely real for individuals. I mean, anecdotally, my mother asked me, how can I find a good place to donate money for like a food bank? And I said, oh, well, good thing you asked, because I did a year of graduate research on that very topic. But obviously not everyone has that kind of ability to get that information. But what I'm seeing is a lot more. And I think a lot of it is a function of the pandemic, is a lot of people saying, I have time, I have money, I want to get involved in something directly. And it seems like one of the ways that people are processing like effectiveness in institutions is actually being sort of there in person. So I'm wondering if there could be a similar relationship with volunteering and donations over time that you saw with like performance data and grants over time.
That's a great question. We definitely have the data to model that. I'll make a note to explore that for sure. I think what you're saying in line, I have a colleague, Mandy Stewart, here at NC State, who talks about that too. She had a CNN interviewed her about that very thing. Like, how do I give when there's so much uncertainty? And she passed along the same, like the best way is to go, right? To visit it and sort of see, and it's imperfect too, right? But it's all imperfect. But the better your relationship, as you allude to, particularly with regard to volunteering, like the better your relationship is with the organization, sort of the closer you can get to the degree to which that mission is fulfilled. For individuals, I mean, that really is the best thing. I mean, I think that there are some financial indicators that could be alarming, that may be accessible through domains like Charity Navigator, although we have Jessica and I have another paper that sort of suggests that, you have to be very, very careful with that and what you think they're measuring. Overhead is not always bad, right? That overhead is often good, and not enough of it can be as big a problem as too much. And so you have to be very careful with those sort of, I Googled it, attempts to get data. So showing up is important, right? And there's a warm glow dimension to that, and I don't think that's all bad, right? But I don't think you're right to sort of increase the degree to which you have leakages.
Yeah, I think with the habitat data, is also in their data is the number of people who volunteered on a site, right? And because they require homeowners to also do volunteers. So that the case that you chose, certainly I think has some really interesting data to kind of examine in there. There are kind of two thoughts as Tracy, as you were asking that is historically, and I haven't seen any data that's come out during the pandemic, but historically, women donate more when they volunteer. That hasn't been the case for men. And I don't know how the pandemic has changed that, but women are more likely to volunteer first, kind of dig in, see what's happening, and then donate, versus men who that's not a requirement to donate. So that could have changed over time. But I do think historically we have seen a gender difference there. And there's a Women's Philanthropy Institute at Indiana University that has looked specifically at that gender stuff. And the other thing I think is more of an opportunity. When people can't find data, they rely on bad data.
Yep.
So organizations that have any data, anything at all, how many people you serve as a baseline, that's a limit, right? Like how many people you serve, that should just be highlighted somewhere because you all have that data. But on top of that, what are their individual characteristics? So demographics, where are they from? What are their income? All the things that you might be tracking for other purposes, whether that's a grant or otherwise, put that data out there in the universe. It shouldn't be hard to get to, because if people can't find that, they go somewhere else, and it's usually bad data. They rely on financial measures, which are not a measure of effectiveness at all. But that's all they have. They go to a 990 and they're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll use the 990 data. So I think nonprofits have more of an opportunity because of this lack of data is to put those effectiveness measures out there. Even if it's not, like Jason said, there is no perfect data. Even if it's not perfect, realize that if there's nothing, that's worse. And I sometimes, and I don't know if you do this exercise with your students, I tell them, pretend you're a donor and go find how nonprofits talk about their impact and their performance. You can't find anything. There's very little that you can find online on their website, social media. Sometimes in your annual reports, there'll be a little bit, number of people served and where they were from or something like that. But primarily, those are not really disclosure documents. They're marketing pieces. So they're like nice photos and donor lists, but not great at really disclosing performance. So it is on us to educate people who come to our websites with that information, whatever it is, however imperfect it is, because lack of something, they're just going to use bad data and say, oh, they spend 32% on overhead. That's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's not true.
You're right. That sort of ties into Mitchell and Calabrese's discussion. And I don't want to give them too much credit. I mean, a lot of it, they are sort of putting back into the discussion from, stuff in institutional economics in the 1890s. But it sort of leans on that notion of distortion costs, right? Like bad performance measurement is often worse than no performance measurement, right? You're constructing something that can heavily distort the way you behave in a way that's not good for the organization.
So how do you and your classes at NC State, how do they engage with the nonprofit sector? Like, do you guys do a lot of service learning classes or capstones? Because some, we here at Northern, there are ways you can interact with us, but everybody might not be within our region. So if nonprofits need help, how do you guys help them at NC State?
That's a great question. Some of that is in the midst of a lot of change right now. We used to have, I think we technically still have it, an institute for nonprofits, and that's largely how we engage. So we're in a public administration department. We're generalists, and so public policy, public administration. So our students do some of everything. We are hopefully launching. We now have an undergraduate minor in nonprofits, and there should be a forthcoming master's degree in nonprofits in the next couple of years, although who knows with our legislature. So that's forthcoming, but historically we would engage through the Institute for Nonprofits. That is changing. The dimension of that is where it lies is shifting, and the size of it is shifting. And so there's a little bit of uncertainty there, but that's primarily where our engagement is. And historically it's been in the domain of leadership as sort of where we have historically provided the most leadership and volunteerism. A lot is because Rich Clerkin is our institutional, a lot of our institutional knowledge with regard to nonprofits sort of comes out of his shop, and he does more volunteering and leadership. But I think we're expanding, right? My own work has mostly been technical, right? And sort of in the arena of efficiency and performance. So we had a nice project with a nonprofit in a suburb of Raleigh, where we helped them think through some performance with how to think about whether or not skills-based volunteers were working. So that was a nice mix of sort of volunteerism and performance. And so, but historically, it's been through that institute. I'm excited to see how that'll change going forward.
So Jason, you brought up a topic that I think is certainly relevant, and many of us have tried to think through, is this notion of equity and funding of nonprofits. And it's challenging because, like you said, those numbers get buried in their financial statements, try to pull out foundation funding. Are you seeing things in North Carolina that foundations are willing to have those conversations about how they make allocation decisions? Because that's all behind closed doors by committees. How they actually do that, and how much do they actually rely on data to do that? And this is a curiosity question, but you had mentioned that issue, so I'm like, oh, I'd love to see. I'd love to see if you've thought about that.
Yeah, I thought about it. They're not telling me. So a lot of my support there and working alongside folks in the area has been sort of at a 30,000 foot view as opposed to what's being allocated where. There was another well-known nonprofit headquartered here in the Triangle that I won't mention. We got pretty far along in sort of pulling some more specific performance allocation decisions, and we were promptly stopped by a couple of very powerful board members from doing so. And I understand why, right? It was distortion cost related, but these things are hard and they're tricky. And one of the things that always the phenomenon has got me interested in this is like this public and nonprofit, if we're providing public services, like, the trade-offs between, how much of this should we be doing in the public sector? If
private versus public support for these things. Yeah.
Particularly if in one domain, we've got much better systems for measuring who's getting what.
Right.
Obviously, there's the trade-off with regard to politics versus independence and all of that, and there are reasons that the nonprofit domain can be more effective in some spaces. But I sort of am curious about what that performance measurement is so difficult.
Yeah.
In the nonprofit space, like what that means for public service provision.
And I think on the foundation side, at least my work with some of the community foundations, is there's so many donor advised funds that the foundation itself doesn't direct that giving.
Right.
It's coming from the families or whoever set that up. So even if you're like, we need to direct more things to lower income individuals or certain populations, well, you're like, the donors set it up for that.
Yeah.
To support symphony scholarships or whatever, like whoever, who knows, so there's certain restrictions that I think make that equity work really hard.
Yeah, no doubt. And even in the bigger foundations that are more set up to think about performance management, it doesn't always work like that. I mean, Chicago is sort of ground zero in some respects, right? That the charter school movement in the city got a lot of philanthropic support very early on for reasons that I have a hard time thinking I have anything to do with superior performance. We didn't even have data. right? And
Right.
so,
It
and
was
the
the
data
field
we
of
did,
dreams.
yeah, we did get it's pretty shaky. And so, but I think that there are lots of reasons politically that people have for rethinking the publicness of a school system, including, unions and power in a city. And all of that is mixed in with who gets what money, right?
Right.
So, I don't think that these kinds of decisions are always neat and clean,
Yep.
but I do think that performance and thinking about it can be often when I talk to either other nonprofit scholars and particularly practitioners in nonprofits, they go, "Oh, what do you study? Oh, efficiency and performance." I often get this like, "Ew," right? Like, and I get why, but to me, it's important for reasons beyond like counting, right? It can be closely tied to, well, if not this, then why are you giving? And that can be a really illuminative discussion in my estimation. So maybe that's a sort of patting myself on the back a little bit with regard to my research agenda, but I do believe that there are implications beyond input output that are worth thinking about.
So I don't know if you've researched kind of the government side of this. Like if you had, let's pretend, if you had a bunch of local officials or state people who are in charge of certain grants, and what would you want them to know or understand about performance and think about? Because I think it's easy to measure pounds of salt spread on a road or stop signs or
Right.
all those kind of things. But if you had them in a room thinking about performance for nonprofits, anything you would want them to think about or to know, let's pretend this ever happened,
Yeah, no,
right?
for sure. I think two things come to mind. The first is there's some evidence that a big reason that local governments leverage nonprofits for public service provision, either through grants or contracts, is because they can be more high touch in ways that are hard to quantify, right? I work with a set of public universities where we design these contracts with nonprofits, actually in Chicago, that support first and second year college students that come from socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds. And because big universities the big bureaucracies can be hard for them to know, what this student is going through. The nonprofits that have that relationship can better facilitate that. So I think being cognizant of you often don't want from nonprofits the kind of things that would fit neatly into a public performance system, I think is important to think about. The second big one I think is funding, right? And so if you're going to require or you want good performance data and for strategic use, this is something you have to fund robustly, right? And provide the capacity to collect data, the capacity and support to analyze that data and to make sense of it. And so a working relationship that both embraces the high touch, but also builds out the nonprofit capacity to use that data strategically, I think is super important. It's one of the great things that came out of the partnership. So my postdoc was sort of writing these contracts between universities and nonprofits. And one of the things that came out of that process was nonprofits were able to leverage the university's student performance system to guide their own decision making, right? So they got access to data that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten, both in aggregate and individual form, and that was sort of contentious, right? But it has some trade-offs. But it, to some degree anyway, they're able to get like grade alerts, for instance, when a student stuff that'd be hard to get otherwise, like working on their own. And so I think it's important for public agencies to think about and be creative and work together to think about ways that kind of capacity for sort of shared capacity for collecting and using and analyzing performance data can help, right? It can't just be didactic, right? You need to do this. It has to be a sort of collective goal, and one that is funded, right? Like that,
Right.
that's a big one, right?
Yeah, I've worked with some nonprofits locally small grants where there is no funding for that. It's program funding, right?
Right.
So program staff are funded, but the paper you use is not. Okay.
Right.
So it's too narrowly defined. I am working, now for the first time on a federal grant, and I was pleasantly surprised that they tell you have to spend between 5 and 10% of the total grant on evaluation. And they fund it. You include that in the grant.
Yep.
But I think that's rare, at least in my experience is rare. and this is a large federal grant. What would be great is that we see that at all levels of government and their contracts, because if they want X, Y, and Z and they don't fund it, they're actually taking capacity away from the organization to deliver service. And I don't think they see that.
Right.
But yeah, I got a small, and it was a federal grant, but this was a number of years ago, a small HUD. It came through as a CDBG grant from the, all the way, trickled all the way down to county and then to local. And I think it was for $5,000. I don't remember. But I spent probably more paper and time that outweighed the grant. By the time you were done, that we had to capture demographic data, income data, and it happened to be to a museum. For like a year, because it went on as long as the expenditures, as long as the grant was open, it went on. And I swore I would never apply for a CDBG grant unless it happened to be $1 million, like so the paperwork would be worth it. So we have to also educate the government side. If you're going to require this, fund it. Otherwise, you're actually decreasing our capacity to deliver service. And I think that's the challenge for us. I'm probably less generous sometimes. I agree that nonprofits are closer to communities sometimes, and that makes a lot of sense. But I also don't want us to forget they're also doing it because nonprofits will do it at a lower cost, accept a lower cost, and subsidize it through fundraising.
Right. No,
and
that's true.
That's just the contract. You've agreed to do it at 30% off, and then you got to go find the 30% somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I think we just got to put that on the table.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, for sure.
So all the fundraisers are like, yeah, right. Because that's what we accept. We accept otherwise, if we were providing it at 100%, the government probably could do it on their own. Because why would they contract it out? So I'm, the close to community stuff I think is in there. I think that's a lot less than lower cost.
Yeah.
Me personally.
No doubt.
Me personally.
Yeah, yeah.
So any other questions from our group here? Because I could just chat with Jason all afternoon. It's so much fun to see a colleague when we've been devoid of conferences. It's just so sad.
Yeah, I missed them too. My kids have started delivering conference talks on whiteboards in the house, and that's how bad it's gotten.
You have to follow Jason on Twitter because he does post about his kids, and he has little ones, right? So they're just more fun. They're just more fun to watch.
Fun is one way to put it. It is not the word I would use, but
I know, it is. Especially in a pandemic, right? All those parents out there, they can totally relate. Yeah, so other questions or thoughts from our attendees, if you have questions about performance measurement in this, again, this space of government and nonprofits and the research that Jason has done in this area, we'd love to take them, or we can call it a little early and people can get back a few minutes of their life. I'm fine with that too, but we want to make sure that if we didn't answer or get to anything that you were curious about when you came, we want to make sure that we can answer it. So you can type it in, or if you want to give me a signal that raising your hand, I'll call on you. You want to do that too. Oh yeah, curious about the gang project. I don't know if you want to go into any more detail than that. Where are you at in your research?
Yeah, so the very early stages. I'm in a preliminary. So it's going to be a book, which is new for me. I'm sort of excited about some of the early sort of.
You feel very free. I'll just tell you, when you're writing, you're like, "What? This is so freeing." Yeah, it's very fun.
Yeah, no doubt. But I plan on doing some interviews with sort of across different timelines. It'll probably be centered in Chicago because the structure has changed so much from the 80s and 90s to a much more local, street to street, crew to crew kind of thing now. And I'm sort of curious about what happened. Although there's a chance I rope in some context from other cities as well. Nice. Like Raleigh seems very decentralized. I don't, you don't hear a lot about sort of big crews controlling much. So I sort of wonder why that is. As far as a hypothesis, I think a couple. I think that there are, right, the transaction cost literature sort of suggests that there are institutional reasons that often big organizations are sort of the preferred venue as opposed to smaller ones. And so it could be something about the environment that leads to that governance choice. Another could be, right, we're in a moment now where we aren't regulating organizations like big businesses to the degree to which we had in the past. And I think that, you know, if you talk to like a neoclassical economist, or, you know, some of you guys have, I'm sure, like libertarian uncles, right? They'll say, hey, if you get hands off, the market will compete and we'll have small firms and low prices. But that isn't what we observe, right? These organizations have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and we've got much more concentrated. Right up 15 years ago, there were 20 cell phone providers. Now there are 3, right? And so what part of what I'm wondering is, does looking at the evolution in market size and saturation of street gangs tell us something about regulation? What's nice, so this is less about gangs and more about organizations, right? It's right, if you I suspect that if you don't regulate something, it isn't that competition sort of bids it down. Competition is costly. And so there's a tendency for organizations to eat other organizations and have a market equilibrium that is bigger than we suspect. And so I think probably regulation plays some role. What's nice about gangs is they are, I think there's a lot we can learn about organizations from looking at them, because it's all illegal, right? So there's no, you know, regulatory, it's like in the wild, right? Watching what they do is sort of a natural environment. At least I think. And so, you know, so you can see regulation in terms of like how hard police are looking at something, and, you know, the role of police corruption and all those fun things that we think about with government, but are harder to understand.
Harder to measure.
Yeah.
Lots of measurement stuff. I know Luke had his hand up, so I'm gonna ask him to unmute and see if he wants to ask his question. Go ahead, Luke.
I think I'm unable to hear him. I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too. It's okay. I think he's working on his, let's see. I did ask him to unmute, but I'll do it one more time. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Hi, Jason. Thanks so much for your talk. The research is fascinating. In former work that I did for the Defense Department, we looked at 2 different kinds of measurement for contingency planning. And oddly enough, it has some overlap with nonprofit work, because it was on civil engineering type work, local infrastructure type work. The way that we were thinking of this was in 2 hats. We had measures of effectiveness, which was basically about were we doing the right things? You know, were we doing the right programs, the right projects? We had these measures of performance, which was really about were we doing things right? And as we sort of bifurcated this, we always had a lot of trouble with the second. The first, the macro level, was a little bit easier to measure, but the micro, the more tactical, was a lot harder. And I'm wondering, as you're thinking about this through the nonprofit lens in your research, how are you sort of thinking through that? And are there things that you've been developing over time to measure that?
Yeah, no doubt. I think part of why the process-oriented stuff so can be so difficult is because it's very complex, right? And the sort of process side of performance, are we doing things right, can depend a lot on how you frame it. And so my own work has been in sort of 2 different dimensions. Just to give an example, I had a project here with Health and Human Services that looked at this in a much more qualitative context, where we interviewed human service agencies, nonprofits, and public about the process, and were able to sort of glean some things that were working and weren't. And so some of it can be very, I don't mean it's pejorative, but low tech in that regard. It's just sort of interviewing and trying to make sense of it. The other thing that I've done in the past is, when it's more process oriented, if there is good data about like inputs, right? And so the resources that you use to pursue your effectiveness goals, and if you've got good constructs as far as outputs, like the quantitative things, there are lots of useful measures from management science that I've used with folks in the past to sort of help compare and contrast the effectiveness of programs in the same space. And so I'm happy to talk more sort of offline about the nuts and bolts about those. But those have been the two that I've used. But, you know, process is hard, because when we talk about this in management systems, it requires, I think, so much awareness of what you want from the process and sort of what you mean by doing things right. And that really can help guide how you evaluate it. But it's difficult for sure.
Yeah, and I think some of this is defined by the organization. So sometimes I'll ask the question, well, how would you see yourself as being, how does the organization picture success? So how do you define success? A homeless shelter might define success one way, and a senior care facility might define success a different way. So if you define success that way, then we can come up with ways to measure that, given that nothing is going to be perfect, that we're going to make some trade-offs in the data. But really, what would you think? How do you look at success? And then I think you can design systems around that. And possibly how does your constituents or your stakeholders, how would they define success? So if your organization is that process oriented, what is a success? Like serving more people, is that a success? Well, maybe, but does that mean that is actually more of a problem because you're serving more? Or your outreach and marketing have done really well, so then that's success. So it really depends on the organization, how you want to define that, and how do you communicate that then to your donors or your funders or whoever? Do they view that as successful if we just serve more? Because I don't know if that's true. I don't know if your funders are like, oh, great, you served more poor people last year. Like, yay, that's great. Maybe not. Maybe that's not what you're supposed to be doing. Maybe you should actually be serving less. Or maybe you should be serving more, but in better ways or different ways, so your impact is more. So I think that whole idea, that notion of how you define success, to me seems to be a critical conversation. Maybe it's through strategic planning or not, but how does the organization look at that? In my mind.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So always tying it back to that strategic plan.
Yeah, we're gonna have to tag team for this is cool that you're tying it right in right into what I was thinking, which is very fun. Other thoughts or questions? I don't know. Cameron, I know you're on the call, so I don't want to necessarily call you out, but oh yeah, you have your hand up too. Good. let me unmute you, Cameron. Hang on one second. I just got to find you in the list. There we go. All right.
Hey.
Hey.
So this has been great. Thank you for organizing this. I think you already answered or touched on a couple of the questions I said in the chat. What I'm thinking about, or what came up in my mind just now, was Jason or Alicia, in your work, do you see any threshold of size or budget of an organization that's able to kind of take that next step in measurement or effectiveness, however that's defined? So in my work or at Taproot Foundation, we primarily serve smaller organizations and building their capacity through pro bono service. And as I'm sure many in the call can guess, our challenge isn't finding volunteers. It's finding nonprofits who trust and are willing and have the capacity to take on a volunteer, to take on their capacity needs. So from your perspective, like, if there is a sweet spot, because right now the market is, to your points earlier, the market is defining the starting point of effectiveness at an organization's size that is far greater than reality. So like, how can we like bring that down by providing those smaller organizations with the capacity to get to that point, is basically where I'm coming from.
So I have like a couple of small thoughts, and then Jason, I'm curious what you think. So I look at performance measurement as also a culture. And I've seen large organizations who do terrible jobs with performance measurement. And I've seen small ones do a great job. If you really want to know how you're doing, I think that is very much an organizational culture kind of thing. Now, you have greater capacity the bigger you are, like staff, resources, and funding. But the organization itself has to commit to knowing, are we doing the right things? Are we doing a good job? If the board and the staff are oriented around that, that's a much easier organization to work with, because you can build in certain efficiencies and do some measurement. So I think it does start with a culture of, are we doing the right thing? Are we meeting our mission? And if there's that commitment, then I think you can build out some stuff. There's certainly size issue when it comes to dedicating staff time and resources and systems, for sure. And we know that the bigger you are, the more likely you're going to have some of those systems in place. But for me, it starts before that piece. So Jason, you can chime in.
No, I think that makes sense. To your point about volunteers, we're actually in the midst of a study now using the same data to see sort of what the marginal effect of a volunteer is on sort of Habitat's operations. And spoiler alert, not very high, right? I think you're right, that there are but it's important to most affiliates to engage volunteers, right? So I think performance sort of depends on, again, like what you put in that plan, right? Like what you say your goals are and the degree to which I'm sort of less of a proponent of having to have sort of, more like scientifically quantified measures for small human oriented things. To me, performance is largely about building the culture and capacity to hold your organization accountable to what it says its goals and outcomes are. And the big thing is, in the absence of that, so I always tell my students this, it's like, why is performance important? Well, if you're not managing to that, you're going to manage to something, right? This notion that like there's just this void of everyone's going to do what they think is best is, I work for a university where when their performance measures missing, politics take the place, and that can be draining and can lead you in the wrong direction. And so, just generally, small or large, I think thinking carefully about performance and strategy is just a way to help guide your organization and keep it accountable. And as Alicia said, I think a culture of that and the capacity to do that. So planning, developing venues to talk about it in a way that is productive. All those things are every bit as important to performance management as the sort of large scale quantifiable things that big public service providers may do. As an aside, one thing we learned from working in the skills-based volunteering space was some medium and smaller nonprofits have leveraged skills-based volunteers that think carefully about performance to help them develop systems, right? So there was one where they worked with, so we're really close to IBM and Lenovo here in Raleigh, and they pulled in some operations engineers to help them think about planning. And this was a meal packaging nonprofit. And so how they were moving, who was working what line and where the lines were going. And so they improved substantially how many people they could serve. And it's a small nonprofit. But by bringing those engineers in, going, you need 5 people here and 5 here instead of 10 here, right? That kind of thing. So I think it just sort of, depends on your operation. But the biggest thing is culture, right? Like that, given that example, like it was good to have that organization in the place where they knew exactly what they were asking that volunteer to do, right? And that's indicative of a good culture and capacity for performance measurement that's in place already.
Yeah, and I think kind of what you had mentioned before too is fewer better measures are better than many bad measures or not great measures. So start small,
Yep.
Pick a few key measures that you can track really, really well. An exercise we do with students sometimes I don't even use the words like performance measures. I'll just say information. So how does your program staff share information with your development staff? How does your development staff share people with the finance people? So information sharing seems to be less scary, more accessible. If you don't share information among your staff and those systems, then how are you ever going to try to capture all of that and communicate that externally? So there's some internal things. The good thing when you're small is that those are pretty simplistic. Those are some Excel spreadsheets that you post to a Google Doc. I mean, they're not complicated. That's actually not a bad thing, is thinking about, and when you're small, you can do that because you're not talking about huge data sets. It's actually a little bit more flexible on the small side, but information and data sharing internally is also an indicator of culture. Like, do we care about this stuff? And I'm sure all of you have, those examples where you were in organizations, we're dedicated to measuring our performance, but as soon as somebody says, well, we didn't do this and we didn't do that, they get screamed at or punished, or so you're like, okay, then we don't share any bad news. Like, got it. We don't do that anymore. That's not a learning culture, right? There's a level of risk when you measure. We do this all the time in higher ed. If a course goes badly, we just don't throw it away. We sulk for a long time. And then we're like, well, how can I make it better? That's a commitment to improvement over time that I think organizations, that's how they have to look at performance measurement, not because it's required of somebody externally, but how can we learn how we're doing, and when we're not doing something, how do we change? So if you don't want to know how you're doing, don't do performance measurement. And if you don't want to change, certainly don't do it. Because it's no good if you do it and then you actually learn you're not doing the right things and you do nothing about it. That's actually worse. For the
Yeah,
staff
no.
morale, it's actually worse.
Yeah, no doubt.
All right. Anything else? I'm happy to wrap up unless there's something else. I do want to thank everybody for coming. As I mentioned, we are going to put this on our YouTube site, and if you go there, you'll find all of our recorded webinars are there. And I want to thank you, Jason, for coming to us and getting kids and your neighbor cooperated, because I didn't hear any tree work happening. So kudos for that. And hopefully we get to be together again soon at a conference.
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity to participate. I love to take credit for my neighbor stopping that tree cutting. I don't that was fortuitous, I guess. But thanks
timing.
again for the opportunity to talk, and nice to meet you.
Thanks so much. Hopefully it gets back to Chicago soon when it's all safe to travel to visit.
Yeah, no doubt. I'll drop you a line.
Awesome. Take care,
Thank you.
everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.